Welcome to Know This Live. I'm Zincle Esamwa. Joining me today is Tina Tchen, the president and CEO of Time's Up, an organization dedicated to making sure that workplaces are safe and fair for all women. For years, she has worked to address issues of gender inequality and sexual harassment and has been an advocate for diversity in the workplace. She joins me now. Thanks for being here.
Oh, delighted to be here.
Yes, and I hope you've been keeping safe and well. I want to take a look at the pandemic and specifically its impact on women in the workplace, which we know has been large. The pandemic has forced millions of women out of the workforce, and they're not returning in the same way that we've seen men. And in April, more women left the workforce than those that rejoined. What do those numbers say to you and signal to you?
Well, they signal crisis. I mean, I think we are, in addition to the pandemic, the racial reckoning, the economic downturn we have this fourth crisis of women leaving the workplace. And it boils down to one of the biggest structural barriers that we have all known for generations as working women that have kept women behind in the workplace is the lack of a caregiving infrastructure in this country. And women have struggled with it on their own forever, but the pandemic just made it impossible with schools out, with child care centers closing, with an inability to access home care services for the elderly and the sick, the lack of any paid leave or sick leave to hold down your job while you're managing all these crises. It has now reached an epic proportion where we see women's labor force participation at the lowest levels since the 1980s. So, in a single year, as you point out, we wiped out 3 decades of progress on women in the workforce. And if we don't address this particular crisis right now, the economy that we build back is going to leave out women.
And a lot of what you're talking about is the care economy. And I know that President Biden has put a focus on the caregiver economy in his American Families Plan proposal. How do you see this sector, particularly given its impact on women of color? How do you see it bouncing back as we have a piecemeal reopening?
Well, that's one of the things we need, which President Biden has put on the table, is a comprehensive plan. For too long, as you say, we've dealt with this piecemeal, right? Sometimes we work on childcare, sometimes we work a little bit on elder care. Mostly in elder care, we're investing in nursing homes, not in home and community-based care for folks. What we never do is invest in caregivers themselves. For literally generations, caregivers have been left out of the formal economy. They were specifically left out of the New Deal labor protections because domestic workers were seen as predominantly Black workers and were not included then. And we've carried that actually legacy through to the present day where we don't have minimum wage protections for caregivers. So we need to invest in them. And President Biden has put that into the American Families Plan and Jobs Plan. But I'm also excited because it's not just public investments. We see businesses stepping up and realizing that employers also have a stake in this because employers now realize that they can't retain the talent that they need. They can't bring women workers back into their workforce. They're having trouble fielding full shifts for their manufacturing floors. And so at Time's Up, we actually have joined together with over 200 business leaders and growing, who want to come together around a Care Economy Business Council and say that business recognizes this is important too.
And Time's Up has definitely gained household recognition, right? It's known around the country. And I know that your focus has been making sure workplaces are safe and fair for all women. So I wonder, how has the pandemic modified your mission and purpose, given that so many women either left the workforce or just weren't going into the office anymore?
Well, in a couple of ways. Number one, the reason we're so focused on caregiving is that we know if we want workplaces that are truly safe, where everyone feels safe, fair, and dignified in their work, they need to be diverse workplaces, right? That's why you need more women, more people of color, LGBTQIA, disabled workers, up and down the wage scale in every workplace. So that's why we have to focus on those structural barriers that keep that diversity from happening in workplaces, like caregiving. But we also know that in this pandemic, sexual harassment didn't go away just because people left the workplace. Sexual harassment is not just something that happens when people are physically together. It can happen over Zoom. It can happen, in the midnight calls that we've been hearing about that workers are getting from their bosses because they feel like they can when there's no barrier between work and home. What's happening in the private DM chats during Zoom meetings. We've seen some of more notorious examples of what has happened on Zoom when people, are on camera. And so we need to be careful about that because the other thing that happens when you're remote is it's harder as a manager who cares about these issues to find out what's going on. And it's much harder for workers to schedule a Zoom call with HR to report something rather than walking down the hallway to sit in the HR office quietly at that time. So, as businesses, we need to really focus on this and pay attention to it, even in a remote work situation, and especially as we're bringing people back to work.
And I think that's an important point, right? Just because the environment changed doesn't mean the issues have changed. And I would love to hear from you about what was unique or what is unique about the sectors that were hardest hit by COVID-19 that may have heightened the impact of the pandemic on women specifically.
Well, we know, women got it from both ends, right? Women are overrepresented in the hospitality industry, in the restaurant industry, in those places that really got shut down and were hardest hit, where you can't remote work. And so women, lost their jobs. That's why the women's unemployment rate is so high and has stayed much higher than white men, and is recovering, much more slowly. Secondly, women were also predominantly frontline workers. When I say they got it from both ends, they also got it because so many of them had to stay at work and put their lives and their families' lives at risk. So women, are the majority of our nurses. They are the majority of our physician assistants, our pharmacy assistants, our grocery clerks. Born and farm workers were still out in the fields picking food so the rest of us could eat as we were all quarantined. And they needed the protections at the time. They didn't get it. They need it now as we're recovering to make sure that they've got the wages that they deserve and they've got the protections in the workforce that they deserve.
And the statistics for women in the workforce now are disturbing, but they're not new. And I know that you've been in this space for a long time. You were a former assistant to President Barack Obama and executive director of the White House Council on Women and Girls. I know you also were the chief of staff to First Lady Michelle Obama, in addition to many other roles. So give us the historical context. What role have women played in the U.S. workforce, but also what obstacles have we been continually facing?
Well, look, our whole economy benefits when more women are in the workforce. Our entire GDP will grow the more women we have in the workforce. It's a huge talent pool we are leaving on the sidelines if we don't make sure we're including women in all industries, in all capacities. And yet, for generations, we have had, these obstacles. Look, I was a single working mom my whole career as an attorney and then in the White House. And so when I got to the White House, working on working families issues and issues like caregiving and paid leave was front and center for me during the last Great Recession. But at that time, 12 years ago, the whole country, workers themselves were saying these are not issues for anybody to get involved with. I'll figure out my own childcare. I just need a job. That's what people were saying 12 years ago and during the last Great Recession. In the last 12 years, we have realized, and that's why this moment is such a challenge and yet such an opportunity. We now realize this isn't just for workers to figure out on their own. Caregiving, building a national caregiving infrastructure is something that requires public policymakers, employers, and workers to all work on together, or else we will not be able to compete globally. Look, we are one of only two countries in the entire world that started the pandemic without a national paid leave policy. We didn't even have a national sick leave policy, leaving 106 million workers in the United States without a single paid sick day at the start of a global pandemic. Like, that doesn't make any sense for anyone from a health perspective, from an economic perspective, from a personal perspective. So we need now this, public sector, private sector, individual workers to all work together to address this. Because look, we are all getting older as a nation, so we're going to need more home care. We have we're nearly 4 million babies born in this country every year. We need more child care. So we need this. We need to solve this problem together. The opportunity, I will say, is I have never seen the awareness in the private sector and in public policymakers that we have today. It is a 180-degree turnaround from 12 years ago when everybody said, not my problem, to now realizing this is everybody's problem. So we have a generational opportunity to make transformational change in how we organize our workplaces, to really bring the American economy into the 21st century in a way that will support caregivers and every worker, up and down the wage scale in every industry.
And something you said that stood out was that at the start of the pandemic, we still did not have, and we still don't have, parental paid leave. So, given that it was a whole pandemic, COVID-19, is it realistic? Can it pass in the US? What would it take to pass?
Well, I'm really excited because for the first time, the White House has put a proposal on the table. The same week that President Biden put that proposal on the table, the Congressman Neal, the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, put an even more comprehensive proposal out there. So we've got a range of options to develop a national paid leave program for the first time. To be clear, a national paid leave program will help small businesses provide paid leave because it's going to provide federal financial support to offset wages. So this is actually a boon to business. It's not, an increase in business regulation, and it's overwhelmingly popular. Poll after poll shows that the majority of Americans, including in red states, support these investments by overwhelming majorities, including the American Families Plan and the Jobs Plan. And so the only people who seem not to have gotten the message, honestly, are some of the Republican lawmakers in Congress from those red states. So we need them to understand that this is what their workers and their businesses in their states need. Look, the businesses that are part of the Time's Up Care Economy Business Council come from 22 of 50 states. So they're coming from all across the country because this is an issue that's not a red and blue issue. And so I am optimistic. I think as this becomes clearer and clearer, as people make their voices known to their elected lawmakers, that this is infrastructure that they need and they fully support. I think that we can turn the tide and really have a bipartisan proposal that will pass, that will, again, really make the changes that we need so desperately in this economy.
And in closing, I know that we've seen, many of us up close, mothers have to make very difficult decisions during the pandemic. Some saying, I need to stay home because there are no options for caregiving for my children. So, what will be the consequences of that in generations to come if we're not able to do the solutions that you have spelled out for us?
Well, look, if we're not, obviously, there are, countless women who will have their careers truncated and cut off, who will actually be less able to provide food and, housing and opportunities for their children because there'll be less money coming in to their household. There, our entire economy, right, will be smaller. Will be less competitive than it could be if we had, if we shut out half of our population from fully participating in the workforce. On the flip side, if we do these investments, look, an important thing that gets overlooked in building a caregiving infrastructure is the investments we need to make to grow a caregiver workforce by investing in it, by giving them fair wages, by giving them training to grow, by giving them the opportunity for these Black, Brown, and Asian women who are caregivers to become business owners in a growing caregiver infrastructure and industry. Because look, this is an industry that we need to have grow because all of us are going to need caregiving at some point. For those of us who are 65 and older, like I have to confess myself, we will, 70% of us will need in home caregiving services at some time in our lifetime. That's a huge demand as baby boomers are aging. We've got a huge demand at the other end of the scale of, children being born. And in the middle, the pandemic has taught us that everybody needs sick leave. Everybody's going to need care, no matter what your age is, potentially at some point in your lifetime. And so we've got to grow a workforce that doesn't exist right now to provide that quality care that everybody wants to have. So that's another piece of this. This is an industry we should be growing in and investing in and developing the workers who are in there. And it's an opportunity actually to invest in a Black, Brown, and Asian and predominantly women workforce. So again, I'm excited about the possibilities here.
Well, Tina Tchen, President and CEO of Time's Up, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Of course, and thank you to everyone for watching. This has been Know This Live. I'm Zincle Esamwa.